going to be putting
I'll
it
send
in
it to
that?
you in just a second.
Okay, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, wait. I gotta send you. Okay, could you send them this updated link? Oh, actually, hang on, wait.
You sending it through Discord?
Yeah, I can.
Or if you have that document handy, just drop it in there.
I dropped it in there.
Oh, okay.
Do a mic check for me?
Yeah. Give me one. Oh, this. Okay, so yeah, this is the.
Check. Check. Check.
Yeah.
Check.
Through Signal.
I just have this, which is
That's good.
good.
just tell these guys they can start whenever they want. And I'll pull up the video. So hard, and now I'm in front of this thing. Yeah. Give me 1 second.
Do you think the Black Panthers were successful? Do you think that they were wiped out by the government, or how do you view the situation?
I think that they were successful because they bred me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I believe myself to be the offspring of the Black Panthers. Mm-hmm. You know, because I see and I learned from what they had. You know, they got did in by the media, their love for cameras, and an extremely sinister government. And they just happen to be born at the same time as a motherfucker named J. Edgar Hoover. So they just was his victims, you know what I'm saying? COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program set up by J. Edgar Hoover, saw that the Panthers were doing a damn good job because all over the country they got this buzz, similar to how Thug Life is.
Drug life?
Thug Life.
Thug life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So now, the Panthers got everybody talking about the Panthers and we want to be free and we want decent housing and talking good, not just bitch hole, you know, straight good.
Mm-hmm.
And they start infiltrating. Now, why would they do this to a young black organization? And why would you not think they would do it to me? They infiltrated them, meaning they got people to say that they were Panthers, they joined the Panthers, and they would start the ruckus. Like, say, let's go shoot up the Botanical Gardens or some shit. You know what I'm saying? And do it in the name of the Panthers, but it's a cop.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And everybody think it's the Panthers because he's dressed like a Panther.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And he's screaming the Panthers, but he's a cop.
Mm-hmm.
He's been sent by the FBI. They got papers to document this shit. You know what I'm saying? And straight up, where Fred Hampton is laying in his bed, they hire his bodyguard to give them a floor plan of this man's house. A floor plan of this man's house. This is what they did to Saddam Hussein. A floor plan of this motherfucker's house. The police is doing this. Had the police raid the shit in the middle of the night. Nobody asked shit, just shoot. This man dying in sleep. You know what I'm saying? And they knew where his bed was. You gonna tell me the police could not get that man? You think you think I can't read? You know what I'm saying? They asked me why I write this shit. You think I can't read? You think I don't know what went down?
Do you think the Black Panthers were...
Sorry. Go ahead.
All right, y'all. We're going to get started. Just wait for the door to close. All right, so hopefully everybody in here knows what that clip was. Before we get started, I want to thank you guys all for coming out. I'm Kenneth. Been asked to guest moderate here along with everybody else who's up here. We talked about this a little bit before. We didn't hand out agendas. This isn't NYU. So basically how we're going to do this is, just so everybody knows, we all agreed up here we wanted to really more have like a conversational piece to this. I don't like panels, and I think everybody else kind of agrees that we don't like panels. So we're just going to power through the panel part of this bit, and then we're going to really start having more of an engaging conversation. Is that all right? All right. So, of course, got to introduce the panel. So to my left here is Michael Stephen Smith. Let me pull out my phone for the bio. So Michael to my left here currently hosts the lefty lawyer radio show Law and Disorder on WBA. It airs on 9 a.m. on Monday mornings and is nationally syndicated. He's the author, editor, and co-editor on numerous books, most recently Imagine Living in a Socialist USA for HarperCollins, which features essays from Angela Davis, Mumai Abu Jamal, sorry, it's been a long day, and Richard Wolff. He worked at a law firm in Detroit in the 60s that represented draft resistors, women's movement activists, and Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. We'll get more into that later. But he was also the plaintiff in the central case in the COINTELPRO legislation. He'll definitely go more into discussion about that. Shameless plug, he's got a new book coming out in March 2019 called Lawyers for the Left, which features a chapter on Boudin and that lawsuit. So some of the stuff we'll be talking about today. So I want to introduce Michael.
So I'm going to introduce Jamal Joseph. He joined the Black Panther Party at age 15 and quickly rose through the ranks, became the youngest section leader of the Bronx and Harlem chapters. He was a part of the New York Panther 21 case. Spent a cumulative, nearly 10 years in prison related to his political activities. Currently, he's a filmmaker, an author, professor at Columbia University, and he's also my father, my first comrade. So thank you for coming out.
So to really start off, so really just to hop right in, looking at that clip, hearing the words of Tupac, in my opinion, one of the great revolutionaries that we had. What are some of your thoughts on some of the words that he said and some of the lived experiences that both of you guys shared?
Hearing Tupac talk about COINTELPRO, it's personally very moving because Afeni Shakur was his mom. He's what we call in the Black Panther Party a Panther Cub. And he was affected deeply by the counterintelligence program because the New York Panther 21 case had all of the elements that Tupac talked about. It had the infiltration, it had the cooperation between New York City Police Department. They had an elite police unit called the Boss Unit, the Bureau of Special Services, cooperation with them, with the Red Squad, and with the FBI. The thing is that as much as we knew as young revolutionaries and comrades in the Black Panther Party, there's a lot we didn't know, and we didn't know what we didn't know. So I'll kind of end on that point because I want to come back to some of those things later about exactly how the counterintelligence program manifested and what it meant in terms of the loss of life and liberation for people who were in the Black Panther Party and other organizations and family members, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, and children of members of the Black Panther Party.
That's great. And Michael, we're talking about COINTELPRO, but for people who maybe aren't as familiar, what are some of the elements of COINTELPRO? What is it? Some of the other types of things that we can identify for it.
COINTELPRO is still with us. It's been around for 100 years. It got a name that Hoover gave it when he wrote the memo that I'm going to read to you in a second, but it's been around since around the First World War. They destroyed the left then. The FBI went after the Communist Party in the radicalization in the 30s and destroyed it. They went after us in the 60s, and they're going to do it again. And if we get one thing out of this meeting, it's going to be how we can best defend ourselves, because we're now in the midst of a fourth radicalization. What's the proof of that? All you folks out there, that's the proof of it. It's finally happened. I'm glad I lived long enough to see it. And what we're going to talk about is what they did to us and how we can protect ourselves. I was part of a lawsuit that Leonard Boudin, who was the great constitutional lawyer in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, that he brought on behalf of the Socialist Workers' Party. That group is kind of a caricature itself of it's now. It's just a sliver. But at one time, it was something. It had 3,000 members. It had a press. It had a headquarters. It had a newspaper publishing. I was a member. We published Malcolm X Speaks. We published stuff on the anti-war movement. We were leaders in support of the Vietnamese Revolution. And the FBI targeted us. And I want to talk very briefly about what we found out as a consequence of the lawsuit that Boudin brought on behalf of the SWP. COINTELPRO was something that Hoover cooked up. And he said in the memo that it was set up to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the movement. That's what they attempted to do. And the lawsuit that Boudin brought took 15 years. There was 8 years of discovery. 8 years of discovery. They came up with 10,000 documents. The judge said to Boudin, "You won't believe what's in these documents." Well, here's, in a nutshell, what's in them. And I'm going to tell you what they did and what we found out about how they did it. And then I'm going to stop talking. So give me a couple of minutes. The organization that we had about 3,000 people, including the youth group. They had 300 infiltrators inside the organization. They had 1,300 informers. They had 20,000 days of wiretaps, 12,000 days of listening devices, bugs. They had 208 burglaries. That's just on a national level. They visited your landlord, tried to get you evicted. They visited your boss to try to get you fired. Somebody I'm very close to had her apartment burned down, had the gas tube in her car cut, tried to blow up the car, lost her job. They sent poison pen letters out to try to create distrust from one group to another. They tried to create distrust amongst comrades in one group. They created factions. And they tried to get you to do illegal stuff to set you up. Like in those days, you could do 10 years for smoking a joint. So they tried to get you to do stuff like that. What was the extent of the victory in this 15-year-old lawsuit? Well, the judge said that the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to free speech and freedom of association, and the Fourth Amendment, which guarantees the right of privacy, you need privacy if you're going to organize something, those things were violated by the FBI. And he issued an injunction, and I'm going to stop here with just this thought. The injunction said you can't do it anymore. And he fined him $250,000. The government came back and said, we're going to still use these files that we accumulated on you. And the judge said, you can't do that. And the government said, what do you mean? You people, you socialists, are a threat to national security. Think about that. Whose national security are we talking about? It's like the Lone Ranger and Tonto when Tonto says, what do you mean, us, you white man? We're talking about the 1%. It's their national security. It's not our national security. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jamal.
I want to talk about Fred Hampton just for a moment. Tupac mentioned it in the phone interview that he was doing. Just a little slack. Thank you. Tupac mentioned it in the phone interview that he was doing. There was a guy named William O'Neill who was arrested by the FBI for stealing a car and taking it across state lines, which makes it a federal matter. O'Neill's assignment rather than go to federal prison, was to join the Black Panther Party. And he became a security captain within the Black Panther Party and was close to Fred Hampton. Fred was assassinated December 4th, 1969. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of Fred's murder. He had just turned 21 years old. Fred was a very, very effective organizer. The term Rainbow Coalition was created by Fred Hampton, the Young Lords. He had politicized Cha-Cha Jimenez when they were both in county jail, who was head of the Young Lords that was the largest Latino Puerto Rican street gang in Chicago. There was a group called Rising Up Angry. There was a group of young white revolutionaries called the Patriots Party. There's a clip on YouTube that if you Google Panthers and Hillbillies, where it shows an organizer named Bob Lee, who was an amazing organizer and a student of Fred Hampton, getting hillbillies, today we'd call them Trump supporters, and talking about housing and the stuff that they were going to do on the west side of Chicago and how they're working together. And there's this famous line with this older white brother saying, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I'm with these Black Panthers. And they created that terminology. We think of it in terms of Jesse Jackson, but they appropriated that. After Fred's death, that coalition came together because they realized that it was murder. And then that same coalition elected Harold Washington as the first black mayor, and young Jesse Jackson said, oh, this works. So that's how it became part of the mainstream politics. This is the time when Fred Hampton's death warrant was signed. It's not so much that the Black Panther Party stood up against police brutality, the 10-point program, but the thing that J. Edgar Hoover hated the most about the Black Panther Party was this Rainbow Coalition organizing, and the program that he hated the most was the Panthers Free Breakfast Program. He testified about that before Congress. He talked about that. One of the acts of COINTELPRO against the Black Panther Party was a coloring book. I don't know if people have heard about this coloring book, that they said the Panthers were giving the kids at the breakfast program that showed police being assassinated and urging kids to take up arms and all of that. That was a coloring book that was put out, supposedly authored by the Black Panther Party, that was created by the FBI. And this is why Fred was targeted. I have to point out it was at the same point in both of their lives that Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King were targeted. When Dr. King was in Memphis, he was there, brothers and sisters, organizing black and white sanitation workers. He had taken the conversation just from civil rights to labor. And he gave that speech almost a year before his death at Riverside Church, where he talked about poverty, racism, and war. And I think we can agree that when we talk about the three evils of capitalism and things that come out, we're talking about the same things. When he began to enter that conversation, denounced the war in Vietnam as a war of capitalist exploitation, Dr. King's words, he was dead within a year. Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam and formed the Organization of African American Unity. Remember, he comes back from Mecca, and we all know the story. He said, I no longer believe the white man is the devil because I have prayed with Muslims in Mecca who were black and who were white and who were Chinese. But it's the speech that Malcolm gave at Oxford University 6 months before his death, where he talks about capitalism and armed struggle. So at a point where you really engage the system and really identify what's really evil about the system, and you talk about those things that you need to be organizing around, is when you sign your death warrant with the United States of America. So Fred was murdered. And we know how cops came in and how many bullets were fired. I've talked to Panthers, my comrades who were in that apartment who got shot. Fred's, the mother of his child was in bed next to her, 9 months pregnant with Fred's son. But it took the People's Law Office, Jeff Haas and those dynamic young lawyers, filing a lawsuit because they couldn't get an indictment against Hanrahan and the police, filing a lawsuit that uncovered, and there was a Senate aide that leaked to them this program called COINTELPRO. And they were able to find FBI drawings of the apartment that was given to them by O'Neill. Remember, O'Neill was working for the FBI, not for the Chicago police. But the FBI supplied the information that the Raiders, as they're called, used to assassinate Fred Hampton, to assassinate Mark Clark. and wound 3 other Panthers that were in that apartment. So the way COINTELPRO looked in terms of the destruction of the Black Panther Party was that the FBI does not like to get their hands dirty. So what the FBI will do is gather information using their technology, using their informants, and then supply and incite local police departments that led various raids and assassination runs against the Black Panther Party. That was how COINTELPRO worked in a military fashion against the Black Panther Party. The other thing that you talked about, my brother, was that how it looked on a personal level were letters, people whispering into one another's ears after meetings, and this led to the split in the Black Panther Party, the East Coast, West Coast split that we hear about. I had conversations with Tupac about this. Tupac was my godson. And as much as he understood about COINTELPRO, when East Coast, West Coast happened in rap, we would talk about that, and I would say, Pac, you know what the FBI did to the Black Panther Party. You need to see what they're doing now to hip-hop, what they're doing to you and the folks that you think that you have beefs with. But how that looks, brothers and sisters, is that you come out of a meeting where everybody is feeling unified and energized, and somebody whispers in somebody else's ear, you know how cool it was when you were on the panel? Well, Jamal is thinking that, you know, that when you leave here, you spoke to someone that looked shady, and that maybe you're an undercover cop. Or maybe that person is an undercover cop. And then they go to my brother, and they go like, you know, you should, you know, or then they come to me, and they go, Jamal, he's thinking that you're getting too much power in the collective, and that maybe you're planning to do a coup within the organization. And the next meeting, we're looking at one another sideways. That trust and that love that was there. Remember that number of 300 informants in an organization that numbered 3,000? What was that number that you? That's right. So there was O'Neill. In New York, there was a guy named Yewa. There was a brother named Gene Roberts, a pig named Gene Roberts, who had been Malcolm X's bodyguard. There are photos that you can pull up on the internet showing Malcolm X after he got shot. There's a wonderful comrade named Yuri Kuchiyama who's holding Malcolm's head. She was the only Asian American that was part of the Organization of African American Unity. When the gunfire started and people were running for their lives, she ran toward Brother Malcolm. The man giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was his bodyguard, who stood 4 feet away when he was shot. He was part of that elite police unit, the Bureau of Special Services. Brother Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik Shabazz, brothers and sisters, drew his last breath from an undercover cop. Gene Roberts was able to use those credentials to join the Black Panther Party and become a security lieutenant, and then do the bidding of BOSS, the New York City Police Department, and the FBI, which was not just to collect information and not just to head off or thwart criminal activity, but remember the key word in COINTELPRO is counterintelligence, to disrupt, to destroy, to turn comrade against comrade, brother against brother, sister against sister, and organization against organization. I'll pause for a second, and I want to come up to how we have to be vigilant today, but I've taken enough time. I want to pause and open it up.
Yeah, well, so I know, like, so DSA, Libertarian Socialist Caucus, and Black Socialist America are very much in a position where they're very much trying to find ways to not be sectarian and to find ways of collaborating along a lot of different lines. It sounds like there's that, I mean, I think that as an ambition sounds like that is a value that is like really important, especially given the context of like COINTELPRO being driven towards disrupting. So like, what would you think is the most important thing for young socialists right now in order to build ties of solidarity?
The thing that was emphasized, and we studied, we really studied hard in the Black Panther Party. People may have heard me tell this story before, but you know, after Dr. King was killed, and I was coming with 2 older friends, you know, riding out to Brooklyn to join the Panthers because my friends had found the secret headquarters of the Black Panther Party. And I just knew that. I saw these brothers and sisters on TV, and they were some bad motherfuckers, right? They stormed the state capitol of Sacramento when they were trying to change the gun control laws, because remember, the Panthers were on the streets of Oakland, California, and Seattle, Washington, policing the police with shotguns and law books, reading from the law books their constitutional right to bear arms, to observe, and to defend themselves. And when California went to change those laws, because they said when we said that all citizens can bear arms as long as they weren't concealed, we didn't mean these militant folks would, up in Oakland, California. And the Panthers responded by storming the state legislature with guns. And all of the powerful white politicians were there when the Panthers stormed in. And they did exactly what you would think these older, powerful white men would do at a time like that. They were ducking. They was like, what the fuck? And Bobby Seale gave this amazing thing. And then I'm watching television at grandma's house, a little black and white TV, and the person is saying the militant Black Panther Party stormed the state legislature of California with leather coats and shotguns. And I was like, they're crazy. And they said, and the police pulled their car to the side, and they found shotguns and rifles and communist literature. And I was like, they're crazy. They got guns, and they're communists. I want to join. Sound effect. We're riding out to Brooklyn, where the first Panther office opened, and I'm with two older friends, and one of my friends leans over and he goes like, yo, man, you know the Panthers are serious, right? Once you join, you can't get out. It's like the mafia. I'm 15 years old. I was like, can't get out. But I couldn't be a punk in front of my boys. I was like, I don't care. Other brother leans over and he goes, you know you got to prove yourself, right? Panthers be taking heads. You got to kill a white dude to be a Panther. I was like, kill somebody. I'm in the choir at church. But I was like, I don't care. Other person was like, nah, get it straight, get it straight. You ain't got to kill a white dude. I was so relieved. He was like, you got to kill a white cop. And you have to bring in his badge and his gun for proof. I get to the meeting, it was packed, the way this gathering is packed. I sit in the back, and the person behind the desk is explaining the Panther 10-point program, which is now 52 years old, but could have been written last year. It has stuff talking about we want freedom, the power to determine the destiny of our community, full employment for our people, an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our black community, an education. He gets to point number 5, which is we want an education that teaches us our true history and the true nature of this decadent American society. I am not really hearing what he's saying. I was like, I'm not a punk. I'm going to show my boys. I jump up and I was like, choose me, brother. Oh, me. I kill a white dude right now. The whole meeting gets quiet. He calls me up, come here, young brother. And I'm standing next to the desk, and he reaches down in the bottom drawer. My heart is pounding. I was like, he's going to give me a big-ass gun. And he hands me The Weapons of Liberation, brothers and sisters, autobiography of Malcolm X, Solo Nights by Eldridge Cleaver, quotations for Chairman Mao. And I'm thinking this is a test. And I said, excuse me, brother, I thought you were going to harm me. He said, excuse me, young brother, I just did. And here's what's key. As I'm walking back to my seat, he said, young brother, let me ask you a question, since you came in here so mad at white folks. He said, if all these racist pig police that are in the community, that are shooting people down, locking people up, he said, if they were black and the people being brutalized and put in prison were white, he said, if all of these store owners that are in the community ripping people off with high prices, spoiled vegetables, rotten meat, if they were black and the people being ripped off were white, he said, and all these jive-time fascist pig politicians, he said, that exploiting and oppressing people, if all of them were black and exploiting and oppressed were white, would that make things correct? And I thought for a second, I said, no, brother, seems like that would still be wrong. And for the first time, he smiled. He said, that's right, young brother. He said, this is a class struggle for human rights, not just a race struggle for civil rights. Study those books so you know what real revolution is about. But the work that you did each day, to really speak to the question, was the work in the community. Chairman Mao said all theory is based on practice. And so you could be a Panther, and we had people who joined the Black Panther Party who were what we call the lumpen proletariat, right? Brothers and sisters who weren't working, welfare moms, people getting out of prison, Vietnam veterans, students, the population that, that Fanon called the wretched of the earth. But the thing that defined you was the work that you did in the community. It was that breakfast program in the morning, because we realized that concepts of freedom, liberation, revolution that when you're talking to poor people who are struggling, those are abstract concepts. They're not abstract to us here tonight because we've eaten at least once today, maybe several times today. We go home to warm places. We have the ability to get around. But to someone who is hungry, who is starving, freedom is a meal, brothers and sisters. And the Black Panther Party organized that breakfast program saying, you know, we hear that kids are disruptive, black kids are not learning, but maybe it's hard for a 5-year-old, 6-year-old to listen to a teacher talk about 3 apples plus 2 apples equal 5 apples, and his stomach is growling. So you organized around that need. Liberation for somebody that is cold and tired and sick is a warm, dry place to sleep. So you start organizing around housing. You start organizing around those needs. And that work defines who you are. That's the work that to us made a brother and sister good. You could say that they were political, but the best compliment that you get is that brother or that sister is a good worker, that they're out in communities doing stuff. The basis of what we have needs to look like this, but the movement looks like that beyond the streets. That rainbow coalition of disenfranchised people that maybe don't read as well, that maybe is not as articulate, that maybe can't tell you the different lines of factional, of ideology, but that understand that I have a basic love. Ask anybody in the Black Panther Party, what's the number one thing that we were taught? When I tell you that we studied, we studied. You know, we studied. You know, from Lenin, Mao, Che Guevara, Amilcar Cabral, we studied. But ask them what's the number one thing that we were taught to believe. And they will answer it like this, I guarantee it. We were taught to have an undying love for the people. And we were taught that all power to the people means all power to all the people. It does mean black power for black people. But it means white power for white people, brown power for brown people, red power for red people, yellow power for yellow people. And when you organize around that, when you're defined by the work, that's what makes you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning when your apartment is cold. And our apartments were cold. We didn't have special condos because we were Panthers. You know, oh, y'all are revolutionaries, you get heat. We was washing up in cold water to feed kids that weren't our kids. Organizing in the welfare centers, in the schools, in those houses where rats were biting kids when they sleep. Then going on community patrol. And then riding home after working 16 hours, having only slept 4 hours that night. And you see the cops have their guns out on someone that you don't know by name. But you understand that's your brother and that's your sister. And you get off that bus and you stand between the cops and that person with their guns drawn. What makes you do that is not hatred and it's not simply ideology. It is an undying love for the people.
Damn, that's dope. So maybe to piggy off of your question there is a lot of times, especially on the left, you know, we get a lot of, we talked about this before, you know, a lot of armchair revolutionaries, people who get bogged down in the philosophical debates about how we should act. What are some of the tangible ways we could bring about, you know, building aspects of the Rainbow Coalition again, putting in the work and building past a lot of these sectarian struggles and motivating people to go out there and actually get up at 5 in the morning and do those types of things? What were some of the things that you guys did?
Well, we you know, what Fred Hampton did and was adopted by the whole Black Panther Party, but I have to say, like, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, New York chapter of the Black Panther Party was strong. Obviously, Oakland, California, Los Angeles. But what Fred Hampton did in the Illinois chapter was that they went out into the community and they said, what do you need? Right? And, you know, I remember having a conversation with Manning Marable before he passed away. And I said, what would you tell young organizers? And he would say, I would tell them to shut up, sit down, and listen. Talk to folks about what they need. And you begin to organize programs around that. And so in Chicago, what was real big for them was the breakfast programs, but that health clinic, that idea of a community health clinic that Doc Satchel, who got the nickname, he wasn't a doctor, but he was so into health, that got shot up and lost 10 feet of his intestines in that raid, that opened that health clinic. That was you know, and it's become a model for a lot of community medicine that we see. That you had doctors and nurses who would, on their days off, come and treat folks. that they would, as we called it in those days, liberate medical supplies so that folk could get treated. That you had people donating food to those programs. We weren't out taking money, we were getting foods, and that you were in the community so that people, when they saw you walk through the community, know that you cared. And then you could talk to them around the issues, and then you could talk to them about what they had in common. So people would come to meetings like this, and then you had people from the Black Panther Party or the black community going back to their communities, talking about women's rights, talking about the anti-war movement, talking about gay liberation as we called it in those days, now it's LGBTQ, talking about those things, but you had folks from the white community going back to their communities, talking about police brutality, talking about housing. So all of those, you understood that you were talking to comrades who were actively kind of organized around those things. In every community that we are, there are kids who are hungry, there are old folks who are eating dog food in the middle of the month, waiting for those food stamps to rise. There are people who are still not getting health care. There are people who are not getting education, and I just don't mean ideological seminars, but kids who need help with math and with science, that need that mentoring. There are things that we have to organize. There are formerly incarcerated folk that need mentoring, that need help. So these are the on-the-ground kind of grassroots issues that if we put the time into that work, that exhausts you, that also binds you. By the way, it helps you filter out some of those folks that are infiltrating your ranks. I know we're going to come to that in a second, but we've got to do that work. People in the community need to know that you are organizing for their liberation, not just for your satisfaction. And you have to be helping them around what they need, not what you think they need. Not to say that we can't. We have to be working on several different levels. But we talked about, in the Panthers, we always talked about the masses of the people, and we always talked about that concept of the democratic centralism, and we talked about the organization is subordinate to the people. We talked about membership is subordinate, to the central committee, but that the organization is subordinate to the people. The needs of the people are what we organize around.
So there's obviously a lot of interest around the security aspects of what socialists need today, and I think maybe you can both speak to that a little bit. I mean, I know for me, there's been a lot of speculation around a lot of the murders of different Black liberation protesters in Ferguson, and I just actually found out yesterday of another one that has been killed, and so there's a lot of concern around okay, so there's a really important need for recognizing our safety, and what are some different ways in which we can ensure activist safety?
Well, I think you start with the thought that the Black Panther Party was the Black Panther Party for self-defense. We are not for violence. We're for self-defense. It's the other side that we have to put the onus of violence on, because that's where it originates. Socialists are for a peaceful socialist revolution. Marx, Lenin, they all said that. But that's not the way it unfolds, because when the ruling class sees that they're threatened, they come after us, and at that point we defend ourselves. And I think we have to have that formulation clear. We have to teach that to people, so if anybody's talking about violence, we know where they're coming from.
I want to build on that point. That kind of organization I was talking about before, and again, it's well documented, the attacks on Panther offices and individual Panthers across the country. There are Panthers who are still in prison 30, 40 years later. Mumia Abu-Jamal, who we talked about. But I also want to talk about the number of things that didn't happen because folks from the community were there. The number of times that the cops showed up ready to raid and folks from the community got out there. Or the number of times that you might have been out selling the Panther newspaper or organizing, and folks from the community came and interrupted what was going on because they understood that you cared, and they would say things like, I don't understand everything they say all the time. But I know they're feeding my babies. I don't understand all what they're calling. I'm not sure that I agree with this whole armed revolution thing, but I know when I got sick that I was able to go to that health clinic when the hospital wouldn't take me, or when that emergency room kept me waiting for hours when my little girl was having that asthma attack. So that's one of the ways of doing it. What you mentioned earlier about the number of surveillance, the electronic bugs, the things that were coming on, brothers and sisters, we give them all of that for free these days. I can only imagine how many phones are turned on now that are taping this meeting that's going to some CIA or FBI or whatever agency is monitoring the movement right now. These phones record without you knowing it. And then in terms of the gossip part, the disinformation part of the counterintelligence program, I was taught as a young Panther, don't say anything in a speech or on the telephone that you don't want to hear again in court. But we think we're safe because we're on a computer or on our devices just to air out all of our grievances. Somebody asked why my Twitter account, Brother Z, we were talking about why my Twitter account is semi-dormant. That's the reason why. I don't want to give them ammunition for free. I still believe in what we call in the movement a face-to-face relationship. And if we had a beef, and even then, if you had a phone call, it would be like, when can we get together to talk in person? So a lot of that. Now, you don't think that people are taking what you might consider your legitimate thing, they can't wait till you get to a meeting, that you begin to air out with text messages and Instagram and social media. You don't think there's other folks, forget the infiltrators, that are not experts of divide and conquer, of making sure that the left doesn't come together? They love that. They're experts of that. The last thing they want is united left. The last thing they want is a left that comes up and saying, maybe we can't agree on all these different things, but let's come up with our version of a 10-point program. These are the 5 things that we can do together. These are what we're going to do. This is the aspect that has to do with community and service. This is the aspect that has to do with the prison industrial complex. This is the aspect that has to do with militarism. This is what has to do with poverty, and we are rolling with that. And if you have anything to say, we'll refer you back to those programs. The rest of it, we will deal behind closed doors. We will duke it out, we'll fight it out. If it has to turn into a mud wrestling match or a basketball tournament, we'll get that out of our system. But when we step out, we're going to be a united front. That cannot be solved on social media. That cannot be worked out if people are in a constant state of agitation and not doing the work. And worst of all, all of your personality things, all of your beefs, you're giving all of the people whose jobs, you have to understand, there are people who are on staff working 5 and 6 days a week. Their job is to monitor your shit and to disrupt you. So why give them that information for free?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So that was super important. And what do you think that we have this sort of entire history of the left, and then we sort of are living in a really unique time where we have like a sort of fascist demagogic president who's reinforcing messages on television every single day. So what of the unique conditions of like this sort of heightened like consciousness on the right and sort of this rise in white nationalism, what are the ways that we can like sort of extrapolate out from these like community organizing programs and sort of deal with the sort of brown shirts that exist and organize around that while still being super aware of the state's intervention and sort of cooperation with that?
Well, Trump is a blessing in the sense that I haven't seen this level of activism in years, right? And then for me as as an artist, activist, as an artivist, there are opportunities to tell stories, to make documentaries and make films, because there are a lot of progressive folks, not just in Hollywood, but the other media centers, New York, whatever, to tell those. So I think that becomes a good rallying cry for us, right? But it's the people. And what Trump was able to do, and you mentioned that model of the brown shirts, Jad, Felipe Luciano and I were having spent some time together last year. Felipe Luciano was the chairman of the Young Lords Party in New York. And he drew a chilling parallel between what Hitler did as this unknown goofy dude that people didn't take seriously, of him and Goebbels saying, if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. And he went to, remember, even though Germany was suffering from economic hard times because of the loss of World War I, Germany had an amazing artistic class. It had an amazing intellectual class. It was one of the best places in Europe to go to university. So it had that, but it had all these Germans that were suffering, and he says, I'm going to speak to those folks. And all of the money that was flowing out of Germany, right? Not to, as Trump would say, to China, you know, but it was going to France and Poland, all the places they invaded first, and was able to play to those sentiments. The counter-organization to that we see is grassroots organization. I'm going to say that that's going to be the mantra. It's going to be grassroots. It's going to be how do you get, because there's more of us than there of them. And when I'm talking about them, I'm talking about those angry, mad white men, right, who are the Trump voters. There are more folks of color. There are more folks of conscience. There are more people that just need some answers as to why they're not working. But we've got to get out there and start organizing them around their needs, because people relate to the people that came in and help them find a way to eat, to get medicine, to get some sense of security in their communities. So it's a great way to get people, you know, to play on that anger and that fear, to get them in the room. But the work cannot just be you know, and we talked about this earlier, Jad. That's not what scares me the most. It's not Trump that scares me the most. It's what it was, the 50 million people who came out. We always knew those militias existed. You have to keep in mind, too, we talk about self-defense. They are armed. And their position is that if we crazy people, all you nuts out there, that if we should win, that if America does be radicalized, they are ready for Armageddon. They are ready for a race war. They're ready to back it up. So as we're going to, you know, to do Pilates 3 or 4 times a week, or, you know, we might be taking a little, you know, a little Brazilian jiu-jitsu, what they're doing, you have people out there who are trained and ready to go. We have to be about grassroots organizing in the hundreds of thousands and then the millions, so that when we step out, it's not just activists, not just people who are politically conscious, not just students, it is the masses of people.
Thank you. And so this question, maybe piggybacking off of this, and then of course, you know, people in the audience, feel free to get engaged. Piggybacking off of that type of thing, one of the challenges I also see on the left is, you know, maybe a term called bad jacketing. A lot of times where, and this happens a lot of times online is, you know, you paint organizations or individuals as, you know, the feds, or they're informants, or they're these different types of people. And so that might be sectarian in nature, but it creates, you know, distrust within movement, within organizations, within just interaction with individuals. How do you move past the bad jacketing that happens a lot of times on the left?
I run a youth organization in Harlem called Impact Repertory Theater. And it's young people, mainly from Harlem, between the ages of 10 and 18. And if you ask them the number one thing that I hate, and they affectionately call me Uncle Jamal, they will answer gossip. And we do workshops with each group each year about counterintelligence program, and we talk about how gossip was used, labeling, bad jacketing, to destroy lives and to destroy individuals. You have to be vigilant. Sister Sonia Sanchez does a great thing where she says, I want you to try to see if you can go a week without saying a bad thing about anyone. And they've come out to see Sonia Sanchez. They love her as an activist. They love her as a poet. And you can see people tighten up. How am I going to do that? I can give up some caffeine or some vaping before I could do that, right? And this may sound a little corny, but when you really start rooting yourself in that, then when somebody tries to come to you about someone else, or someone says, you know, Ken was in the meeting saying bad words, and they go like, not that brother. I've seen him be very upset that some things were wrong, but he refused to say something bad, and he refused to say that we should take any action until we sit down in a group in person, maybe with cell phones outside so that stuff is not being taped, and try to work that out. It seems so simple and so basic, but it is a powerful, powerful weapon. If you become that movement where that doesn't exist, if that becomes one of your bylaws, if that becomes one of your fundamental principles, you create a safe space, but you also shut down about 75% of what any counterintelligence program or whatever name they have for it now that we'll discover in 5 or 10 years. You take away the teeth of 75% of how it operates. That's good. Now, see, even on that, I got some half applause. You know, it was like, I'm going to stop talking about them, but those other people, I don't like that collective that come in. Look at y'all. Come on.
Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, do we want to open it up to the audience?
Yeah, before that, I wanted to, and before I get to your question, one of the things that I think before we open up to the audience, because obviously the audience is going to have a lot of questions, one of the things I wanted to ask, really, when we have this intimate time up here, is some of the things we were talking about, is moving forward, what is the future that you see for all of us in terms of movement, in terms of struggle, in terms of our own individual treatment of progressing socialism forward?
I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but we don't have much time. This is, human beings have been on this planet for 200,000 years in an organized way. And if we don't do something quick about climate change and about the threat of nuclear war, we got about 20 years or so to stop that. And I think that we have to educate people and organize people around that central notion. Otherwise, we're in a lot of trouble.
Right on. Yeah. I'm very encouraged. I had to say this to a friend who's an amazing attorney and African-American, grew up in Harlem and doing a lot of death penalty work. And he and his wife were talking about what the young people are not doing and how hopeless it is. And I have to say, I've got to tell you, I have a whole different perspective. Because I'm fortunate I get to speak a lot of different places, and I get to speak not only to organizations, but to colleges, universities, but high schools and middle schools. The level of consciousness now, what kids are aware of, the questions that I was at a school in Harlem with 7th graders, the questions they had for me about the Black Panther Party and about Afeni and Tupac, I had to fight back tears. To know that 50 years later that these kids were aware, asking me like specifics about specific folk and about the 10-point program and that. So I'm very, very encouraged by what we have and the energy. If we do that grassroots organizing, if we are able to create a movement that really sees love as armor in terms of what we can do, I think that the future is bright, and I know we will win. Remember, the movement is cyclical. There's a great documentary that was on PBS a few years ago called The Abolitionists. Did anybody see The Abolitionists? A really tremendous documentary, because what people fail to realize is that the end of slavery didn't come because Lincoln said, I want to free the slaves. It was expedient, right? Do you understand? It was expedient. But it came from a movement that had come into existence, the abolitionist movement, 30 years before. And that movement was made up of enslaved folks, formerly enslaved folks, rich folks, poor folks, white folks, black folks, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. I know we go now, you and Uncle Tom in the book, but it was a vivid book. It was the best-selling book at the day, and showed people the horrors of slavery. She lost a son in the Civil War. She took a lot of her money and put it into the movement. So you look at a Frederick Douglass, you look at all of those folks, you look at John Brown, all of them were part of a movement. Frederick Douglass went down with John Brown and spent 3 days arguing with his brother in the woods, was this the right move to make? And left in tears. That's the kind of talk that we're talking about. Folks in the movement knew one another, and they were struggling together, and they were organizing around people's needs. So when you talk about the true power of the people, And when you talk about that kind of grassroots movement, please take that with you. That spirit of armed love and that spirit of grassroots work, we are going to win, brothers and sisters. We will win.
So I know we have one person back there.
John?
I want to first of all thank the speakers for being very informative. I have learned a lot in the past hour regarding how important community outreach is, how fundamental it is in organizing. I'm a member of DSA. I joined in 2014, right before it blew up. So when I joined DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, it was like an irrelevant small organization, mostly made out of people who are really immersed in theory, not doing much about it. Something that's really good that has happened in the past couple of years since Trump was elected was much more activities on the streets, much more outreach than we had before. However, something that I am concerned about as a rank and file member is that there is a lack of theory and political education in the organization. It seems like a lot of people who have naturally risen up in the leadership, who have experience in the organization, have experience in other organizations, in being activists, shun people learning about Marx, about Lenin, about Malcolm, about theory in general. So I'm wondering what y'all think is the role of theory in activism, and how central it is to organizing, if it is even central. Thank you.
I'm going to pass this one to Jamal.
So among that day that I told you about that started usually at 5 a.m. in the Black Panther Party was 3 or 4 times a week political education classes. And sometimes your PE class would be from the 10-point program. Sometimes it would be from Fanon. Sometimes it would be from Mao, from the Red Book. Sometimes it would be from the New York Times, just to read it and point out the contradictions. And the idea was that when you were out in the community, that any Panther was capable of organizing. And that if there was one left standing, that you could continue to organize. And around this theory, this is an important lesson that I was taught by Afeni Shakur. Afeni Shakur taught me as a young Panther, she said, Jamal, the goal of the Black Panther Party is not to have every man, woman, and child in the Black Panther, in the Black community become Panthers. She said the goal of the Black Panther Party is to live by example, to teach the people the possibility of struggle, and to make ourselves obsolete. So if you really do your job, you don't need organizers, because the people are organized. To that end, knowing what you're saying, so that it's almost if you start talking and somebody was like, you DSA, right? I was talking to somebody just last week, and it's not just kind of random things. You know, everybody should bring their own vibe and their own personality, however you speak, however you, as we used to say, to break it down. And it would be amazing to see not only Panther leaderships, but young Panthers be in a college classroom and debate a professor who might be a PhD in economics to a standstill around economy, around capitalist economy and Marxist, but also then be on the street with a brother and sister and break it down so that brother and sister on the corner could understand what was happening, right? And not that they were being communities and switching up, they just understood organization and what we were fighting for so well that they could make everybody understand. So yes, political education and having a curriculum and having, like, what do we want a member to be? What do we want them to be about? What do we want them to be able to do? What's the message we want them to bring? Whether they're talking to somebody else who is educated and smart, or whether they're talking to someone who's semi-homeless on the street. It's real important to have that foundation, that grounding.
I'm going to make a shameless sales pitch. A couple years ago, my wife and I edited a book called Imagine Living in a Socialist USA, about how everything would be different if we got rid of capitalism. And I brought a couple of copies of the book over there if anybody's interested. They're $5. If you want them autographed, they're $4.
There you go. That's the way to start. See that? That's what I'm going to do when I get my next batch of Panther Baby. That's how I like that.
Are people familiar with Panther Baby? Jamal's book? Get it. Good book.
Hi. You're a very impressive speaker. I come from a father who was a socialist and revolutionary in the 60s, and some of the things I've learned, Lenin, Trotsky, et cetera, et cetera. I just joined DSA recently. I have a lot of problems with it, you know. No, I love it, but I have a lot of problems with it, and things you're saying, you know, are bring tears to my eyes, tears of memory of, you know, whatever. COINTELPRO not only destroyed the Panthers. So I want to start by saying, to me, in my history of just living from that background, the Black Panther Party was one of the most revolutionary organizations. Came out of the 60s. There were others that were smaller, and some are unknown, like probably the ones that my father came out of from the SLP and the smaller propaganda groups. But you know, the level of harassment from the right and the capitalists and you know the right whatever was horrible. We've all you know suffered, and I worry about it all the time. But anyway, things that key things that I worry about within the. Maybe I shouldn't say this, and some of the things I'm going to say might sound like an agent provocateur for whatever the COINTELPRO is right now. And a lot of times this has been my problem in the SWP, in the Spartacist League, in the International Marxist Tendency. Every group that I've tried to join, a Trotskyist, I have never been able to become a member except for this, which is the good thing about it being an umbrella, is that I can get in. But I get kicked out a lot. I get thrown out. You know, I argue. I don't know. I'm not a little rough around the edges, but I consider myself a real revolutionary. I'm wearing a button. Build a revolutionary liberator. This is just a premise, so you know who I am. And I might sound like I'm the agent provocateur, but I am not. I assure you. You mentioned democratic centralism. There's a bylaw in the DSA that you cannot. You can't be a member of the DSA if you are also a member of a democratic central organization. I think that should be something DSA should focus on to get rid of. And we probably should struggle for DSA to become a political party if we can, or well, at least you should get rid of that. Because I think, I don't know if Panthers had, I think from what you said, they did have democratic centralization as organizing pretty well, a united front. Also, arms, and the whole question of, you know, violence. I think Malcolm X's one of his speeches that always stuck with me was like, when you start talking to me about violence, you know, what are you talking about? You know, they're always going to paint us. The enemy's always going to paint us as violent. Self-defense is the key. Violence is part of it. Yes, we would love to have a peaceful revolution, but good luck. It's not going to happen that way. And also class, focusing on class. Not you talk about the people. I know because you're a Black Panther that I'm probably not arguing with you. I'm just picking at a couple of things to the audience, really, to say, not just focus on the masses or the people, because the people, that language can be used by the right to organize the petty bourgeois right-wingers. What I'm talking about, you're talking about the working class. I'm talking about focusing on the working class, building workers' militias, things like this, not just grassroots, which can also be used by liberals and sort of quasi-half-socialist, half-capitalist.
I don't mean to cut you off.
Sorry, see, that's the point. I just want to focus on those few things. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's not, you know, we talk about, there's nothing you said that I disagree with. So, but even when we talk about working class these days, we're talking about working poor, right? Because most working folks are a paycheck or two away from homelessness, from struggling. Everybody is living in perpetual fear. One of the biggest weapons is credit, right? Capitalists invented this thing where I can hook you, you can have anything you want, and you are hooked to the system, you are hooked to working and all of that. So a united front, and I'm glad you used that Rainbow Coalition, the Panthers did a conference organized, and it was, out of it came the National Committee to Combat Fascism, and created this idea of a united front. and grassroots folks from all over the country came, where organizations came to begin to talk about what are those things that we can agree on and that we can work on together. And that's such an important conversation to have. We will never work it out. There will never be one faction of the movement that becomes the gold standard or the people's standard for how everybody should be thinking, what they should be doing. But I guarantee you, even if we were to do it tonight, that you'd be up, and by 3 or 4 in the morning, we could leave saying, here are 3 things we all agree on, let's go to work on that. That's what we have to do as a movement.
If anybody would like to ask a question, we have 2 microphones. Oh, great.
Hi. So I was reading today and yesterday about new studies that show that our life expectancy in the U.S. has gone down because of opiates and because of suicide.
And because of suicide, yeah, I read the same.
And I know it's because of despair from the working class. You know, I've lived here for a long time, but I'm from Kansas, so I know a lot of people who still are on the factory floor, who work on Boeing, you know, and they see all of the contracts go, you know, to Airbus and that kind of thing. And also because of the Republican experiments, they're totally bankrupt. I mean, the despair is real. And so I mean, what do you say to those people? I mean, how do you help? You know, I have friends who are doing stuff like running for councilman and that kind of thing, but like the despair is, like children go to school like 4 days a week. They have long vacations. If there's parent-teacher conferences, they're just out because the state is bankrupt. And so I'm not sure what to say to those friends. It's not like they're going to go to college now suddenly at 40 or something. And so I guess the despair of the working class is something that I worry a lot about. I know that's why people are committing suicide.
Absolutely.
So I'm not sure what to... Is that a question? I mean... So I guess it's what I'm thinking about a lot, like how to help. I know Kansas is not the only state. Kentucky's one, Illinois is one, so.
Yeah, this is where it takes, go ahead, please.
Well, the short answer for it is socialism. The long answer is how do we get there? The Democratic Party is not going to do anything to help us. Had Bernie Sanders taken up Jill Stein's offer to take over as the presidential candidate of the Green Party, we would have had a mass left-wing movement, but he didn't do it. Instead, he sheepdogged people back into the Democratic Party. We've got to build our own independent political party. And I can't tell you how encouraged I am to come to a meeting like this and see people and get that kind of response, because I think we're all on the same wavelength, and that's what we have to do. We can't individually supply a job to that fellow in Kansas. We don't do that. But we can make a demand. We can make a demand for jobs for everybody at union wages. We can make a demand for $15 an hour. We can make a demand for free college education, Medicare for all. We can pull together a group that stands for all of that, and we outnumber them, like Jamal said. They've only got probably 1/10 of 1%. We've got the rest, and we can build a movement. We just have to have confidence that we can pull that kind of thing together.
I agree with what you said, but what this sister is saying is, how do I talk to my friend who is in such pain and such despair that they don't feel like they can make it for another week? What do I say to them? The programs that we had in the Black Panther Party, we call survival programs. And we actually said survival pending revolution. And those came about from understanding the models of cooperatives as they existed in socialist countries. So that folks will understand saying, I'm having a hard time feeding my family, right? But if 10 of our families got together and we put all of what we had so that there was a communal table every night, all right? So that that twice a day, folks could get a meal. The kids could get a meal going to school, and their kids could come back. We can have something. On those days when the parent-teacher conferences are running so long, if me as a laid-off teacher and as somebody else who has a college education but maybe not a teaching degree, if we came together and did something at this community center or at this church or any place that will give us space one day a week, we can create a curriculum and do that. In the Panther Party, we call those liberation schools. By the way, a lot of those things we take for granted now. For example, that breakfast program, my comrade Erica Huggins always pointed out the fact that the Black Panther Party, at the height of the breakfast program, an organization that was basically broke. We didn't get grants, we didn't have anything, but we understood how to go out and ask for space, how to go out and ask for food, how to get Panthers and volunteers to feed it. We were feeding 50,000 kids nationally. And as Erica says, we shamed local governments into doing more. The same thing with the people's health clinics. We shamed them into doing more. So we need to get back to understanding, and we need those kind of organizers who can go in and, yes, talk about those issues, but we know this organizer that says, like, here's how we're going to eat, right? Back in the day, we used to have fish fries in Harlem. They were called rent parties. Somebody was about to get evicted, right? You know I'm dating myself, but people will come together saying, we're all going to have a fish fry, right? Everybody's going to come get $1 to a plate, and we're going to make sure that Sister Sadie don't get evicted. We're going to do something about that. We're going to feed those kids. That idea of power to the people and that idea of what the people are able to do now, and maybe comes out of this an idea of where do we get that institute, that kind of training institute for folks who have those organizational skills, folks who know how to start those programs, to train a cadre of people that can go into those areas and show people how to use the tools in their community and what they have to have some survival pending revolution and some hope pending liberation.
Awesome. Just piggyback on that for a second. I just want to piggyback on that for a second. It isn't just extended to the people who are on the ground. What about for organizers? Because I'm pretty sure a lot of us have been at a point where you look at the situation, you look at the work that needs to be done, and you say to yourself, man, it's hard. It's tough. There's been times when a lot of us have probably felt despair, looking in the mirror saying, I've tried talking to these people. They might not understand where I'm coming from, or when times when this room may not be as full. What are some tools or things that we can do as organizers to help better ourselves and not fall into the pit of despair?
So, so one of the things that Jad and I want to work on, and this is not as a direct answer to the question, but we have a project that we want to do called Grassroots, and it is about organizing. And it is about people who have done it around programs and around simple issues. The Black Panther Party's first victory, a lot of people go like, yeah, the Panthers were rolling Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and Bobby Hutton with guns and all that. The Black Panther Party's first victory in Oakland, California, was getting a stoplight put on the corner where black kids were getting hit by a car. That was their first organizational victory, right? So, in the meantime, right, what folks should do is we should start doing case studies of other people who have successfully organized around different issues, right? And that can be part of the PE class, right? This is a case study. These people may not be really political, they may not be socialists, but they figured out how to do something in that particular community. How to get a traffic light, how to help homeless folks, that was some. How to deal with lead poisoning, how to get the city to pay to lead poisoning in this particular block, how to get people to pay to the incredible asthma rates that were here. How did they do that? There's so much that's out there that we can learn for how people did that, right? Those case studies, and then seeing how we can begin to implement those in the communities that we're organizing in.
So I have a very specific question about some work that the Queens DSA is doing in, I'm sorry. So I have a very specific question about some work the Queens DSA is doing in NYCHA, Queensbridge houses, Astoria houses, Ravenswood. Right now they're trying to privatize NYCHA. The city is trying to offload their responsibility. They want to give leases to private companies. They're literally trying to destroy public housing. So I feel like there's not a lot of time to save public housing. You know, what would the Panthers do at a moment where they're trying to eliminate public housing from New York City? You know, what would they do?
So, again, those numbers. Panthers would be in those developments, organizing the folks with programs. And that's how you get people to come out. And then getting those masses of folks, the residents themselves, to put pressure, to be in the streets, and to be putting pressures by sheer numbers. Because people understand those votes now. If you look at the percentage of folks that vote versus folks that don't vote, politicians are not paying very much attention. Because they're going like, this is not only an underserved and underrepresented community, but these folks don't vote. But when they understand that people are out, the grassroots folks, the majority of folks are out articulating those issues, that's what makes a difference. The student movement helped end that war because of the masses and the masses of students that were out there. Not just that, but going back into their communities and talking to their parents who were business leaders, who might have been congressmen, who might have been politicians. It's something when your kid comes home from a college break and saying, I'm not having Thanksgiving because that's a fascist, you know, we robbed, you know, from the Indigenous People Day, and you're a fascist warmongering pig, Dad. That stuff works. We don't think that it works, but that works. So those numbers of folks in the street, so that you have however many hundreds of thousands that are out there doing, that's the work. But it starts with starting to organize them around their needs.
So that's the transition we're trying to make. So we're in the communities, we're canvassing, we're having these conversations, we're listening, we're not talking, we're not trying to be anybody's savior. We're listening to the community and hearing their needs, and we're trying to work on that. But how do you transition to into the programs?
So my question is, who is the Cha-Cha Jimenez in those projects? Who is the Fred Hampton in those projects? You know, who is the Ida B. Wells there? Who's that next generation of leaders from there that grew up there that's in the mix? Who is the former gang leader?
Okay.
That may not be super political, but just knows that I love my community.
Okay.
I love folk. Who is that person? That's who needs to be empowered.
Okay.
That's who needs to be funded. And if it's grassroots funding, so be it. If it's, I'll bring my youth group out to perform. I'll come speak and do some to raise some money to fund that thing, so that these dynamite folks, so that grandmother, that person just coming out of prison, that teenager who can rhyme but can really organize, can get the support they need to create those programs, and so that the face of leadership and transformation looks like them, not folks descending from the outside, but stuff rising up from the inside.
Thank you.
Don't go away, sis.
Thanks. I'd like to know more about the history of COINTELPRO, and I'd also like to know, given what you said about the Socialist Workers' Party finding out through their lawsuit that fully 1 in 10 people in the party were agent provocateurs or were, infiltrators. Given those kinds of numbers, how can we structure our democratic organizations to resist that and be able to continue our work in the face of an extremely organized and well-funded counterintelligence program?
I think that you have to be very clear about what you stand for. And if you're clear about what you stand for, then it's hard to get an agent like that to make you deviate. The great example I like to think of is Lenin's party, the Bolshevik party that made the Russian Revolution. The Tsar had a parliament called the Duma, and one of the members of the Bolshevik party sat in the Duma. That person was an agent in the Cheka, in the secret police of the Tsar. But because the Bolsheviks were very clear on what they stood for, this guy had to follow the party line. And they kept him in track. And I think that's what you need to do. You have to be open, you have to be transparent, and try to keep things in line by doing that.
Yeah, well said. I just totally agree. I totally agree. And if it's about the work, if there's nothing that they can incite or indict you for, then there's nothing that those agent provocateurs can do. They will fail at that mission, or they might be converted to just come forward and says, you know, I came here thinking that I wanted to destroy this organization. I'm here to support it, and here's who I am. When you do that work with that kind of focus and that kind of clarity, that's your best defense.
And there are cases of people that did just what Jamal said.
Yeah.
Then that presents another problem. You know, what do you do with them? But that's that's what you do.
I mean, the thing you can't do is to mimic the enemy. People have said, oh, we should have a screening process and we should do this. Again, when you start to talk to folk about their history, if they just showed up, people do have a past. People do have families. And so you could talk to people about, in the same way that you were interviewing someone for a job, what would they like to work with? What would their spirit like? You know how I can tell if somebody was really in the movement? Because, you know, at the height of the Black Panther Party, there were maybe 15, maybe 20,000 Panthers. But boy, if I listened to it, there were like 5 million of us, right? Because everybody was like, my daddy, everybody was in it. And so this is, and I don't blow up anybody's spot. I don't say if I, you know, because I was, you know, an officer, because I was a lieutenant and then a captain in the organization. I don't do that. But this is what I say. I look at a person's eyes. If they say they were in the movement, in the Black Panther Party of the Young Lords, I watch their eyes when a baby is crying in the room or when an old person comes. And I can look at their eyes and see how they relate to that child. If I see love there, if I see concern there, I would say they were around us. If they weren't part of us, they were around us and something rubbed off. So I can't say enough that if we begin to animate the center of what we're doing for love for the people, love for liberation, that begins to set a very, very high standard for your work and for your behavior.
Thank you, guys. I think we have learned a lot from the Black Panther Party. I don't know if we've internalized those lessons, but I think we've developed a kind of new vocabulary to describe some of the same issues we've been experiencing for years. And what I want to know is what you think about this notion of intersectionality. It's a buzzword that just describes essentially the fact that a lot of the oppressions we all experience are shared, right? But I think one of the things that we experience in these social justice circles is, I'm not really sure how to describe it, but a pitting of issues against one another. So whether it's immigration or police brutality or Palestine or whatever it is, we find that our coalitions are fractured. It's almost as if you can't work on one thing and something else, or, you know, at the political level, we're willing to forego immigration rights for Black immigrants if we can get them for others, or there's always a kind of quid pro quo, and we haven't really formed a united front around any of these issues that are all so interconnected. So I just wonder either what you all think or what you think the Panthers would say, or how they would advise people working on the front lines of a myriad of issues as to how to really practice intersectionality in a way that is meaningful and effective, particularly in this political environment where there seems to be a added bonus points to getting people to sort of clip one another off, if you follow me.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is in what you said. This idea of a united front, this idea of this conference that the Panthers held, and then creating these a national committee to combat fascism, but the work of the committee members was to work on each other's projects. So you had people, so not everybody that worked in the breakfast program or the health clinic in Harlem was from Harlem or was Black. And by the same token, when anti-war rallies were happening and other rallies, we worked on those in support. So there was always support, and there were always people from other organizations and from other committees working with each other. And in our political education classes, we were saying that we understood that capitalism is an octopus and that we have to deal and wrestle with all of those tentacles in order to get to the nerve center, in order to destroy it. And you have to keep saying that and keep saying that and keep saying that. It's like having a family member, right? And someone in your family might, be suffering from, a particular illness, and somebody else is going through, having gotten laid off, and somebody else just had a fire. You don't pay attention to one thing as a family. You figure out how to deal with all of those things to help your family. The more we start thinking of this movement as a family, and the more we start understanding that all of those issues are our issues, the more we can build that united front.
All right, just a quick thing. We're going to end soon, so we'll take some more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. So what that guy was talking about earlier about the DSA from Queens and how you told him to prop up the people who live there. So I'm really a bad speaker. Sorry. I wanted to know. So, a lot of the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement have been assassinated, and I was wondering, how do you reconcile propping up people in the community with them being safe? Does that make sense? How do you protect people even though they're being propped up? Because I travel in a lot of anarchist circles, and we have a policy: don't photograph, because if it gets online, and hey, there's that person, now we get to target them, and the alt-right and Nazis, they love to dox people, so we have to make sure to keep their identities a secret. So that's a really powerful thing. So if you have an identity, you can use that identity to hurt the movement. So how do you reconcile propping up the people who are in that movement with keeping them safe? Thank you.
It's hard. It is a risk that everyone takes when you become an activist. I like to think of it as empowerment, and in the sense of going into those communities and seeing where the natural leadership lies and seeing how you can empower them and how other folks can know that they have to be vigilant and use those lessons of history, from Black Lives Matter to what happened through, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and anti-war movement and, labor movement, the women's movement, and just understand how important it is for all of us to watch each other's back when strange things begin to happen. In the Panthers, we couldn't go out alone. When you went out into the community, you had to move in 2s and 3s. And you had to check in every so often to let folks know that you were all right. And so you have to build those systems so that people know how to watch each other's back and how to be safe and how to always have someone around. But we can't abandon the idea that it's going to take some organization and it's going to take leadership coming from within those communities. This is very, very important work. Not just us coming from the outside, but leadership coming from those communities, and that leadership developing programs that people in those communities are feeling the direct effect, those survival programs, is a key to building a mass movement. Someone told me a great example of civil rights movement. And when Dr. King and other folks would march from a particular community, they were folks from the community that would join the march. But here's the most powerful thing. There were folks in the community along the way that had water. They were coming out on their porches giving water and giving food to people while they were marching. They understood that they had a role to play in the movement. I may not be able to leave my kids. I may not be able to go on this march, but I'm damn sure going to make sure that those marchers are fed, and then when they get too tired, they can sleep in my house or sleep in my backyard that night. And real movements understand that you engage people at the level of their ability and their awareness. And we used to say that means that we will let the bakers bake, and we will let the carpenters build, and we will let the teachers teach, and we'll let the healers heal, but there's a place in the movement for everyone.
What do you say? Would your advice be for socialists, specifically in New York, where a lot of people, assume because we're a blue state, we elect a lot of Democrats, we have a Democratic governor, we have now a Democratic state senate, but we still have these massive problems. We're still at the center of global capitalism, and a lot of people are struggling, while also not alienating people, liberals, that could potentially, come to the more left-wing side. What would you say to those people to organize?
Again, it comes back to practice. I keep circling back to when people think of Dr. King, they think of Montgomery, a bus boycott. But they also think about how they used that boycott, how they got people back and forth, and all of the thousands of people that were using their cars and their trucks to get people back and forth as ambulances in some case, right? When people think of the Black Panther Party, first thing that comes up is what? The breakfast program. And then a deeper dive is the health clinic and the free clothing program. You want your organization, and again, to become synonymous with what program? Oh, DSA, you're the folks that are doing, fill in what that blank is. That will make other folks come around, because the proof in the pudding is not just in the baking, it's in the eating. What is that day-to-day work? What's that thing that becomes synonymous with who you are in the community?
All right, we're going to take one more.
I just have a question about, we talked about love and unity, and what I stumble over is that, and the question about intersectionality, is that I am a white woman and I have this disease of racism in me, and so if I want to be in community with people, I feel that I need to look inside myself and not just kind of be I don't know, one of those good liberals, it's like, so I don't know how to, is it a thing that I go back to other white people and push that? But I mean, especially Jamal, I hear you talk a lot about love and unity and staying together, but there's so much muck inside of us. It's a disease. And so if I want to jump into the love and the kumbaya, so to speak, and walk away from looking at myself and looking at what's in me, how do you... I know there's intersectionality, but how do we touch on racism and talk about racism, especially from a white person's
Yeah, we have to do the work, right? The work of transformation, right? And so this is the part of the work that you say, even as I'm working on myself, I'm doing some other things, right? It would be like whatever a particular thing that we want to come over, some bad habit that we're doing. We don't shut down everything else while we're working on that particular thing. We're saying, like, I'm getting fitter, I'm going to lose the weight as I'm doing certain other things. I'm going to overcome this, or I'm going to learn a new language as I'm doing this other thing. So the work and being involved with other folks, the best way for us to do it is to, in a way, even as we're struggling with that, we got to get over ourselves. You know what I mean? It's not all about us, and it's not all about us being totally correct before we serve. So in my organization, Impact, we teach the young people that they're leaders of today, not leaders of tomorrow, that they're activists now. And one of the things that I like to say when I speak is that there is no start date to activism and no expiration date for dreams. We have to do the work each and every day. And the more that we can get outside of ourselves and be engaged with other folk, the better it is for our own transformation, our own healing. If we try to figure it all out, if you try to figure anything out at a time, Jad and I are working on a screenplay now. He's helping me with the pilot that I'm doing, a television pilot about Panther Baby. I'm trying to adapt it. And a lot of times we will stop saying, let's just figure this scene out. You know what I mean? What's the inside and the guts of this particular scene, and do that as a building block to the whole thing, right? If you stop and you try to figure it all out in acting, if I have any actors in the room, that whole thing, let's be in the moment, let's be fully engaged. Let's be fully engaged in the moment and understanding that I'm working on me by working with others, and that becomes an exchange that helps the community, that helps the movement, and helps myself.
I think
That was a good answer, Cooper.
I think something that we were talking about before we started this panel was one of the things that my elders taught me is that you can't be afraid of conflict. And some of the things that we were talking about before is that, liberals shy away from conflict because they want it the easy way. And we as a determined people in struggle, we want it, unfortunately, the hard way. Because we know that's the most meaningful type of change. And so it's about having those honest conversations, struggling together, having that conflict, but most importantly, not shying away from it. Because that's when we have the best moments. So with that, I want to thank our panelists. Before we end, I also want to thank the Star Bar for having us. If you haven't donated to us paying for this space, because space is very important, paying for the labor of the panelists and the people who are serving drinks and food, please do so. Also, BSA, we really haven't talked about them today. I want to thank them for hosting this as well with DSA.
Yeah. And there's a new Black Socialist website. Do we know the URL for that?
And also today, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So also today they launched a donation on their website, so feel free to also donate and support that as well. This is a collaborative effort, so definitely donate for the space here tomorrow and donate for the causes so we can have more of these types of spaces and engagements later on.
And thank you for Black Socialists and the other co-producers of tonight, Libertarian Socialist Caucus, LSC. You can sign up for LSC in the back.
There's also a Afro-Socialist Caucus of DSA, which you can also, that you can also sign up for. So we encourage you to do so.
I just wanted to say it's wonderful to see all of you. Thank you for coming to this. Please tune into my radio show. It's called Law and Disorder. You can hear it on WBAI Monday morning at 9 o'clock after Amy, 99.5. And this week's a very good show. So tune in.
And, of course, the last thing I like to say with these events is I want to thank you all for coming out. I think everybody in here is in agreement that this event wouldn't be possible without, well, if it was just us, we probably still would have talked. But it wouldn't be possible without you guys, so thank you guys for coming out.
And I have to shout out Jad, who made it happen. My schedule is crazy. And he was like, Dad, you're going to do this. So thank you, Jad. I'm so glad you're here.
All right, y'all. Have a good night.